This January in the portal, we will be hosting Layman Pascal and Hayden Smith for a month-long investigation into apocalyptarian hyperhumanism. Apocalyptarianism is a concept developed by Layman Pascal to confront the way death, grief, and the impossibility of our moment can be a source for building. Hyperhumanism is a concept developed by Hayden Smith, focused on using technology as a means towards exploring the higher ends of the human being beyond the pleasure principle. Together, Pascal and Smith will actively attempt to build a bridge between these two concepts for a new understanding of the human condition. To find out more or to get involved this January, check the links in the description. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name is Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Layman Pascal and Hayden Smith. Both Layman and Carl are friends of the channel as well as friends of the portal. Layman has been on several times to discuss his work with the Integral Stage, the Nietzsche Anthology collaboration, and many other appearances. Layman has also been in the portal last year with Bruce Alderman to explore his work with the Integral Stage. And Hayden Smith has also been on the channel several times to discuss his concept of hyperhumanism as well as his involvement with the Philosophy Portal Network more broadly. And he actually led a session in the Edge 2 years ago on the concept of hyperhumanism, and this January, both Layman and Carl will be in the portal for a session, Apocalyptarianism. These are strange times, and I think strange times call forth the need for strange intellectuals. And I think what I mean by that are intellectuals that don't just bring their abstract cognition, but their entire being to the picture. And I think Layman and Carl both fit that definition. Kind of an experimental laboratory of spiritual, philosophical, and religious cognition about how do we as human beings approach the reality of accelerationism. And I do think that framing it as the reality of accelerationism is the right way to put it, in the sense of, before we came on the recording, this idea of the acceleration of technology and capital is kind of self-evident, and it dominates the world that we're living in now. But the philosophical, spiritual, religious responses to this reality are still in their seed forms. And so perhaps that's what we're going to be coming out on the other end of this project, with a deeper understanding of how to sense make in an accelerationist reality. I'll start with you, Layman. I've done some work recently with Michael Downs, Nick Land's work on accelerationism. It's been kind of a touchstone for me in thinking about it over the last few months. But what perspectives have you explored in regards to this idea of accelerationism, and perhaps how it connects to your broader work and concepts?
Yeah, I grew up sort of very informed by people like Terence McKenna. So my first thought around accelerationism is there's a slope to time itself, and we're accelerating into the hyperdimensional object at the end of time. But that's not really what we're discussing. This is a much more techno-historical kind of inquiry that we're doing here. So the stuff that I've noticed that you've been doing around accelerationism on the Philosophy Portal focuses on this historical and psychoideological deadlock. We seem like we're in a stuck place in the world whose pressure almost forces forth a feeling of acceleration. We've got all this distracting foreground stuff. We've got this meta crisis, these entangled background multi-scale crises, and it all seems like it's resulting from the quasi-liberal machinery of modernity, an adaptive way of regulating the planet that doesn't prioritize the increase of general human and ecological thriving, and which does extend the old nihilistic problem that we're dissolving our sources of meaning and value. So in the face of that, you get different kinds of quasi-accelerationist reactive movements that want to participate in a leap toward a new stability while empowering themselves technologically. There's this pseudo-conservative, re-territorializing version where maybe we could surrender to the logic of capitalism and ally ourselves to ethno-nationalism and leap forward into a new world where a half dozen major hegemonic power spheres control everything. And then there's this other hollow leftist movement that dreams depressively of an international multilateral uprising to protect labor and marginalized classes, maybe with the accelerated assistance of mass automation. Both of these strike strike me as failed and doomed responses. Doomed responses to this deadlock within modernity, an intra-modern contradiction that I might call humanism versus capitalism. And I think that deadlock has to do with flat or denuded versions of what both of these things mean. And they're denuded because several key dimensions of what they ought to mean are left out. These sort of excluded elements are largely what I'm not only pondering myself, but seeing and hearing when I'm in the field of deliberately developmental spaces and new culture communities, new philosophical movements, new shamanic networks, those sorts of things. So what are the elements that I think are being left out of our analysis of that deadlock? I think, first of all, there's a lack of existential training, which means, yes, spiritual and religious praxis, but especially and maybe fundamentally ways of handling our inner lack and inner antagonisms to produce more coordination and assimilation of our fundamental drives. A lot of that involves the use of ordeal and ritual and the intelligent use of suffering and our response to internal contradictions so that we can transmute libidinous vectors that are currently feeding the system that dominates the world. The second absent thing, I think, is quite obviously ecology. It's absent from most of our techno-social and ideological conversations. I think we need to reconceive the intersubjective and technological role of humans within the biosphere so that we are working more with definitions based in organic complexity and in the notion of participating in the colonization of the noosphere by successful ecological patterning styles. The third thing I think, third place where it's being left out is an inability to discern what natural thriving patterns are like and how they are different from other kinds of patterns. Because if we don't make that discrimination, we can't participate in steering our technological and educational process. I think there are different kinds of acceleration, different vectors. We have to be able to very clearly see the ones that coordinate with existing successful natural complexities. And that changes all sorts of things, right? There could be more or less natural ways of accelerating capitalism. There are more and less naturalistic ways of accelerating human organizational structures, more or less naturalistic ways of building new technologies that take us to an imminent and emergent point where we can't predict the mutations that are going to occur to fundamental aspects of reality in ourselves. But the fourth thing that I think, the major thing that seems to get left out in my thinking, is this marginalized role of the weird and the alien and the inhuman as something that must be endlessly met and embraced and assimilated in order to produce the human and to produce the natural. So the inhuman, not as fundamentally the disruptor and antagonist of everything we hope for the human to be, but the inhuman as something whose antagonism must be recognized and assimilated in order to reproduce what it means to be human in any epoch, and in particular, epochs where there's radical technological and social shifts that generational adaptation aren't fast enough to solve. So I think that's where we are now, and this gets to the apocalyptarian principle that we're not just in a time between worlds, between one paradigm and the next. We're already in a world that feels like the betweenness of things, a liminal world, a world where apocalypse-like vibes is the air we need to learn to breathe, like climbers on a high mountain, a world that requires a return to a lot of our shamanic capacities, a world that requires new strategies for becoming indigenous faster, a world where we have to root, assimilate, and work with the strangeness as our fundamental ecosystem itself. So rather than thinking, can we avoid this or can we not avoid this, we need to be thinking, what are the skills and circumstances we need to promulgate in order that we gain the capacity to adaptively thrive in precisely this kind of a world. There's a great book by H.G. Wells called Mind at the End of Its Tether. And I think I have a similar feeling to Wells, which is we've pretty much gone as far as we can individual rational waking state consciousness. The problems we have to face in order to transmute the situation that the acceleration is trying to solve, this requires subconscious, collective, computational, symbiotic, and ecological intelligences. And that's going to feel weird. It's going to require prioritizing new and archaic skill sets. It's also where I think Carl's neo-shamanic and ecological humanist approach to a human mutation fits in very nicely.
All of that was fire. I'll start with the importance of your reflection on this false dichotomy that you're proposing as kind of like failed attempts to sense make in an accelerationist reality. On the one hand, you could have something like an ethno-nationalism revival. I think you said it's a pseudo-conservative approach versus what seems like an empty leftist international revival of a workers' movement or some sort of protection of workers. And I guess the question that's coming to my mind when you were speaking specifically about what I would interpret to be the quote unquote true path between this antinomy, working with the lack, working with the antagonism, not just for itself, but for higher order coordination between us as individuals. And I think you said for the assimilation of our drives, perhaps the darker dimensions of our being. And I'm trying to think about that in the context of I've been reading a lot about what people like Peter Thiel and what people like Elon Musk think about the regulation of AI, which would be some sort of slowing down of the accelerationist tendency, and they link it to the idea of the Antichrist. They think any regulation of AI is Antichrist, and that's used, I think, to create a antagonism between the national and the global, and an erosion of the international. But what I'm thinking about is how can I think differently about the international than I might be predisposed to think about the international? Specifically, are the networks that we are building already the international coordination that we need to feeding into in some sense? And well, that would be a network, I suppose, of apocalyptarian beings. And in that context, specifically, you're highlighting of what skills do we need to become apocalyptarian beings. I think that's where I create the link with Carl's work and the hyperhuman techniques. So that will be part of also what we'll be exploring together. Carl, I suppose the same question to you about how do you make sense of accelerationist philosophy, the idea that we live in an accelerationist reality, perhaps its connections to transhumanism, but also its connections to your project where you're trying to rethink transhumanism or rethink technological singularity from a hyperhuman perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Cadell, and thanks for the invitation. This is such a fascinating topic. So I guess my take on accelerationism is this idea that the claim is that we can't return to these older models because we're already embedded in these runaway systems, and that we should therefore amplify the forces that are already shaping us. So it's kind of an anti-nostalgic perspective. But I think there's the left and the right in accelerationism. So the left is saying we should seek to repurpose this technological process for the collective emancipation. But on the right, which is a much more problematic perspective, is that it's embracing this market-driven intensification as an inevitable force. And you've already mentioned Peter Thiel. We've got people like Elon Musk saying that money is itself going to be eliminated because everyone's going to have such abundance that we won't need money. And I was just talking to Layman before about, Tristan Harris has just been on the Diary of a CEO podcast, and he was talking about the fact that once you eliminate those service jobs in, say, the Philippines, is OpenAI gonna pay universal basic income to everyone in the Philippines because they've just wiped out their ability to earn any money. So, or maybe money doesn't exist. So I think it's really when the real highlight for me is when people like Peter Thiel are asked recently, should humanity survive? And he's just there gawping like his fish, his famous fish, sort of like doesn't seem to have any kind of empathy. And I think it's much more important to be kind than clever in this new dawn. And I think that the pseudoscience of transhumanism is evident that their basic premises. I spend a lot of time with people that are interested in extending their lives through supplementation or different practices, and they don't look any younger. They're on all these different techniques. They're all like fascinated by living to 500 as the basis, and I'm like, it's a big fuck you to nature, and also it really goes against everything. Like the paper that I wrote for you in terms of the Nietzsche anthology, the paper I wrote around this theme of, the last man is actually the transhumanist, not the overman. The overman is the hyperhumanist, and I think we can dive into that a little bit more in the course. But it's really, my current sort of thing is stay human, because I think we are endangered, and I think that's being relished and celebrated by the right accelerationists, and they are all too human in terms of their stance and their outlook. And I think that it's If anything, that's the kind of humanity we want to veer away from. So how do we really become the overman rather than the last man?
Can I just quickly follow up with another question there in regards to the human is in danger and the last man is the transhuman, the overman is the hyperhuman. Whenever I hang around you, whenever we work together, you're always innovating in terms of your relationship to technology and how you create your own boundaries, borders, and almost like you're just like Tristan Harris, you're a kind of living technological ethicist
Mm-hmm.
in some deep sense. So when you think about the difference between the transhumans who are trying to look young until they're 500 versus the hyperhuman, what kind of things are you doing? What kind of skills, what kind of techniques do you think we should be exploring from a hyperhuman as opposed to a transhuman perspective?
Well, there's a whole bunch, but I think some of the basic ones would be, get into your peripheral vision. Start looking, beyond the screen. Like if you can practice your peripheral vision, and athletes do this before a big race. I do it before a big talk. Just, do it now. Like stop staring at the screen. Try and take in the whole 180-degree image as a whole image, and you will notice that your physiology starts to calm down. I think it's this idea of going into altered traits rather than altered states, because altered states are to a penny now. It's like you can pick them up, at your local sweet shop. Whereas altered traits are earned. So this is when you actually spend a lot of time progressing a skill, integrating a psychedelic experience. At the moment, we see a lot of people in the psychedelic scene, especially just chasing their next peak experience, not learning anything from the gifts that they've been bestowed. And really, I think that's the root of this fast food culture. It's spiritual bypassing. It's if anything, it's just inflating the ego, exactly what you don't want. So I think, how do we really earn these change in states, and also really just trying to adopt these forms of double consciousness. Like how do we stay in two places simultaneously? If you think about the shamanic experience, the shaman, would go into the shaman. You would go to the shaman, you would have an issue, right? You'd be ill in some part of your body, whether physically or psychically, and the shaman would take the medicine and go into your body and remove the obstruction. But the shaman was both in your body and in the physical world at the same time, bridging worlds. So I think I've written a lot about double consciousness, and I think that's a literacy to distinctly be in two fields of experience simultaneously. I think perceptual diversity is another hyperhuman skill where we see this ability to understand that we are one Umwelt, we are one sensorial system where there are many, many, potentially millions of Umwelts with other species existing in extremely different worlds whilst being in this world. So how can we tap into these other Umwelts? And of course, there's a myriad of techniques to do that as well. And both, we talked again, Layman talked about this with me about, the large language models now being used to decode the languages of other species. And maybe we will be able to open up communications with these other species and understand their Umwelts. We know that sperm whales have their own phonetic alphabets now, and there was actually, I was talking to Anil Seth about this, that he had got involved in this project, which is one half of Google, and they actually started to, they've decoded this language, so they still don't fully understand it, so they've started experimenting. They start actually putting these languages out into the ocean, and the typical hubris of the human is that the whales come because they think there's a whale calling, and in fact what they were transmitting was a whale in distress. So all these other whales turned up in huge distress. So I think that there's huge ethics around this topic, and I think that this comes on to my next point, which is technology should be used as a scaffold. A bit like when you were learning how to cycle your bike as a kid. You would have stabilizers potentially on your bike for a few weeks or months to actually learn the skill. But once you learnt the skill, you remove the stabilizers. And I think that that's the approach that we should be using, not dependency, which is the transhuman trait, but scaffolding, using it as a synthesis, using it as a catalyst to learn new skills, develop new senses, and then just becoming much more. We all hear about this touching grass from the Gen Zers. Let's make sure that the oldies go out and touch grass. But I think wrestling with the medium, playing with paint and clay, and being embodied. I think this is in fact one of the big opportunities that AI is giving us, because so much of our cognition and so many of these skills that we thought were the high-end skills will be inevitably taken over by machines. So we do have what remains, which is our physical embodiment and our subjective experience. So the haptic creative practice, I think, is another hyperhuman area of great relish. And then, of course, your imagination cultivation. This is huge. I think Marshall McLuhan was right around this idea of cold media. And what I do in a lot of my projects is really develop cold media. And cold media is enabling you to be a co-participant in the actual content, right? So when you read a book or you listen to a radio show, you're filling in the visuals. You're filling in the majority of that work. And I think that, this is why the Museum of Consciousness is sound only. We do long forms of 6-hour shows in extremely uncomfortable seats, because we want you to be uncomfortable. We want you to be active, and we want it to be like a meditation. And I think long form content, again, is hyperhuman, because we've got used to this meme that everything needs to be short form content. And I think the problem is we've all got ADHD because of that, because we can't concentrate. That's why I like your work, Cadell, because you amass these huge essays before breakfast.
And I'm hyperhuman already, Carl.
Yes, you are, exactly. So I think maintaining time for daydreaming, slowing down in terms of that instant, which is why I've always smashed my phone, so that I have to use another adapter to actually get to my phone, so I don't constantly use it. What is it, 150 times a day that people use their phones or look at their phones, incessantly and constantly interrupting any kind of imagination. So, I think, all of this stuff really results in attention, and maintaining your attention, your awareness, and combating the extractive attention.
Awesome. So I want to comment on a few of those themes there. I'll offer a quick story that might be helpful for deeper reflection about what we're trying to achieve with our month. I think you both commented in your own way about how the development of this technology, the investment in this technology, specifically AGI and related technology to robotics, is often framed as it's going to liberate us into abundance, that we're going to be living in a hyper abundant world. I think that the real of the situation is that this technology is going to be used to eliminate most wage labor, and that it's going to force us into, I would say, an apocalyptarian situation where we really have to get creative about value. And we have to get really creative about what does it mean to be human. We really have to explore that question that you always bring up, Carl, about, are we even human yet? And when you think about the history of the human species and wage labor, not even wage labor, just labor in general. We were hunters, we were gatherers, we were farmers, we were industrial factory workers, we were office workers for most of our lives. And I think when I talk about, the possibility of AGI eliminating wage labor and getting curious about value and getting curious about the mystery of what it means to be human, I think, and the question of, are we even human yet? I think that the history of what humans have done for most of their adult lives is, leaves a huge question about what our potential is. Because, are we just farmers? Are we just hunters? Are we just industrial factory workers? Are we just office workers? I mean, these are incredibly limiting jobs. These are incredibly limiting roles, and they do not exhaust in any way from my perspective, incredible insanity of the human imagination and the incredible potential of the human being. So in some sense, I think that's where our work is situated. And quickly say, I was just last month at an AGI conference speaking with one of the, I think, leading figures of AGI, Ben Goertzel. And I think my role at that conference was to play a kind of double consciousness. role, in the sense that I was constantly bringing up the antagonism between the people at the conference talking about immortality and having bigger brains and wanting to fly around everywhere as immortal beings, versus the real of the conference, which was radically disconnected from any political program, completely unreflective about the nature of the conference itself, being in Istanbul at a very fancy hotel, but surrounded by, from my perspective, an immense poverty, and not being able to go deeper into this dimension and explore the sort of the splits between, I would say, fantastical technological visions of the future and the real of politics. So there's a lot there, Layman, but I mean, the main thing I wanted to ask you, or, maybe a source of reflection, is the difference between what I perceive in a lot of accelerationist circles, which forward abundance narratives, versus the apocalyptarian perspective, which I think is, at least helps me get at the real of our situation in a more profound way.
I think the one is a precondition for the other. One thing I loved about what Carl was saying was the phrase, "we want you to be uncomfortable," right? It's uncomfortable to move in a transontological or doubled condition. It's uncomfortable to go through ordeal. It's uncomfortable to go through attention training and to resist the immediate things that are being offered by your culture. It's uncomfortable to undergo the intentional struggle that's needed to create more coherence between the subsystems and drives that make us up as a complete human being. But that's necessary in order to produce a capacity and a consciousness and a sense of coherence that is more than what we need for our ordinary tasks, right? To generate surplus, you have to go through a process that initially feels uncomfortable, feels like you don't want to be part of it, right? And that can be at the sort of religious level of human integration. It can be at the spiritual level of how we organize our own insides. It can be at the level of can we or can we not adapt to the world that we're in. But there are a lot of emotions, a lot of realities, a lot of contradictions and fragmentation that we have to take on board somatically, perceptually, emotionally, and cognitively, allow ourselves to be disturbed in those ways so that we can become the crucible in which we generate an abundance to participate in a world of abundance. If you get AGI without what I call HGI, like human general intelligence, then the human is removed from the picture. There could be all kinds of abundance that sacrifice everything else that we need because we have to show up as capable of living in an abundance world, assuming that's even possible. And the way we get there is through the reverse of the affects that we think we're seeking. Right? The culture is offering glittery, shiny, smooth, immediate things. But the only way that you build up an abundance capacity in yourself is by leaning into things that feel dark, apocalyptic, contradict, antagonistic, lack, all those sorts of things, including all the experiences that traditional human beings had with nature, which is that it's confusing, it's mysterious, we can't get a handle on it, its patterns are nonlinear, its patterns are complex, it contains things that freak us out. Our internal nature is like that as well. So I think we need to have like a revived shamanic cast. We need to have a new sensibility for human beings, and we have to have a sort of a cultural ethos in which it's desirable for anybody who wants to be able to thrive as a human being under the new conditions, to go into all of these apocalyptarian sentiments, to discover the capacity to be a participant in an abundance universe, assuming that's objectively possible.
I've always appreciated this paradox, I think, that you're highlighting between AGI and HGI, between artificial general intelligence and human general intelligence. I've actually just recently been writing about how the intelligence that's being put into the generation of artificial general intelligence is itself extremely narrow, and their goals are extremely narrow. The motivations are extremely narrow. And I always saw that as something fundamental to your project, Carl, and hyperhumanism, that it seems to me when you get into the hyperhuman, you are exploring, from my perspective, and when you're asking that question of are we human yet, you're exploring the question not of AGI, but HGI. That is a human general intelligence. Do you think that's a fair way to frame it? And how does Layman's emphasis on the negative, the antagonistic, as well as the mysterious and the confusing and the nonlinear and the complex. How does that all fit into how you understand, if I'm not stretching the term, human general intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are fundamentally agreed that, as we talked about, I think we're just scratching the surface of what it means to be human, and that also includes the intelligence that we're capable of if we were to suddenly open up all of those senses that we have access to. Not the 5, but the 34. I mean, how many of us are aware of those 34 senses, and how many of us are therefore not utilizing them? But also, I think that it's, to focus on the lack and the difficulty of the human experience and not to negate it, I think is vital. I think we learn way more through our pain and our suffering and our grieving than we do through any success and any abundance. And as soon as we live in a world of abundance, we are screwed because, what's the stats on the standard Scandinavian who is basically like looked after from cradle to grave. They've even got money for your funeral, sorted. And, that comfort is killing. Comfort kills what the lack of comfort creates. And I think if you're really uncomfortable and have a very vast period of fasting or something, that's very difficult, and then you receive some comfort, then fantastic. But if you are comfortable and you receive more comfort, you are screwed and in a really dodgy state. So I think that, most of our greatest works have come through suffering. Most of our greatest songs have come from heartbreak. That's not going to change. I don't think no matter what, that's not going to change. And of course, it's like children running the world who are just, I don't know, too comfortable or want to maintain this power. And I think that even if we look at digital necromancy, this idea of keeping people alive beyond their sell by date, the fors and against, I know this is going to come up, and I lost my mum last year, and I would have been horrified if I could have pushed a button and brought her back in some digital capacity. Just to comfort myself and to soothe myself, because I needed to go through that transition, that massive ability to grow and to understand that my time is limited. And through that limited time, I have an opportunity to really do the work. And I see a scenario where people don't ever suffer bereavement because they are given a fake mirror and on a fake opportunity to never suffer, and it's never going to lead to what we want in terms of the human flourishing. And I think that's my focus with hyperhumanism, and it's a journey from hyperhumanism to hyperhumanism. How do we be generally more humane to ourselves, to our loved ones, and to everything in nature, because we are nature, and as soon as we even use the word nature, we create a separation. And I think that's part of the problem, the fact that we see this as external. There is nothing external. So how do we understand ourselves as embedded in this nested ecology? And everything in nature is not soothing itself.
I think there's such a desire for containment. There's such a desire for protection, for safety, for security, for comfort. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the big paradoxes of the modern world. I think that, and it's understandable as well, because we come from such scarcity, and we come from world. I mean, my granddad told me about when he was a kid, 1930s in Ireland. A banana and an orange was like a great Christmas present. Like a banana and an orange was a rare thing. And so when you're living in a reality like that, where a banana and an orange is like a once in a year treat, rather than I just walk out to the kitchen, after this podcast, and I think there's like 20 different bananas and oranges just there. I don't even think about it at all. It makes sense that we would presuppose that mindset, that abundance would give us what we want. And when I follow the transhuman, when I follow the AGI discourse, when I follow the accelerationist discourse, I mean, the abundance narrative is still the strongest one, but it seems to me like what both of your philosophies bring to accelerationism is a critique of that. That, and we can juxtapose it with lack, we can juxtapose it with contradiction, we can juxtapose it with antagonism. that abundance is this idea of a full surplus, of a completion, of a full reality where everything was present. I guess the final thing I'll say is that, Carl, you said it's like there's children running the world. And one of my dominant perceptions when it comes to the types of people who are creating this accelerationist reality is that oftentimes they appear to me to be like boys with toys. Now, they're very smart boys, and they're very complex toys, but still boys with toys. And the question I think we're getting at is, okay, we've got all these toys. We're in this kind of ridiculous political world where it seems like a very infantile mind is governing it. A very narrow intelligence is governing it. And what I want to bring back around to you, Layman, is a question that's connected, I think, to our month last year with the integral stage, where we're kind of talking in a meta way. And when I was writing about the integral stage project, I was thinking about it in a meta way. These online networks that we're a part of, and we've been a part of for at least 5 years now. I call it a para-academic network. I think you probably call it the liminal web. I think there are other people who call it different names. But it's kind of like a mechanism of international coordination emerging in all of this that is pointing towards the need for a different type of being, pointing towards a different type of philosophy, a different way of sense making. So again, there's a lot there, but how would you relate to what we've been saying?
There's, I think, a general maturational crisis that we were just discussing. And in order to mature and develop as human beings in a way that's more than just, because sometimes in a lot of what I call the overlapping developmental, transformational, and regenerative networks, there can be a lot of focus on, witnessing yourself and inspecting your own patterns and sort of growing as a more complex cognitive being. And that's a part of it. But the actual sophistication and complexity and range that it takes for a human being to grow and develop is much greater, and is often revolved around immersion in difficult circumstances, in ecological conditions, in relationships, and in suffering. Now, we shouldn't idealize suffering necessarily. There's a lot of stupid suffering. There's a lot of suffering we go through just because we're addicted to suffering or because we haven't adapted the systems around us to take care of it in a smart way, right? And we know that in general, sort of mid-range ongoing suffering is degenerative for people, but periodic, intense, voluntary suffering is necessary in order to restore beings. And this is an insight that I think is haunting these networks. I place a lot of trust in these networks. I think there's a sensibility here. I think there's a burgeoning skill set and a cultural ethos that probably is the one that needs to go along with an expanding biodigital network civilization that can grow up in the cracks between the existing power structures if they don't destroy the entire system. So I think there's a tremendously important work involved in that, but these networks have to be well informed about the human condition, about the realities of the world, and what it takes to mature as a multidimensional being and not as some kind of spiritual idealistic fantasy or some kind of dark, depraved, anti-spiritual fantasy. It's got to be a very rich, very complex, ongoing and developmental project to mature the beings who inhabit these networks so that we could actually become the people capable of inhabiting the world that we imagine might be possible through what these networks have in common.
The thought experiment that's running through my mind as you stop speaking is, imagine a baby that never cried. It's like, it's impossible. You extend that, like a family that's never had internal crises. I think when you think about the human life, and perhaps the example of a baby is the perfect one, is that crying, being upset, being frustrated, not knowing what you want is absolutely constitutive of the system. And not only is it constitutive of the system, but because it is constitutive of the system, a baby is something that actually can endure that negativity. And does endure that negativity. One moment it's crying, the next moment it's the purest form of happiness that you could ever see. And I think in some sense, connecting with that is what maybe the intellectual mind defends against. And I'm interested in why the intellectual mind defends against that. I think this is just a fundamental psychoanalytic question in a certain way. But it also seems connected to your idea of hyperhumanism, Carl. So like when I give that thought experiment of the baby, like the baby that never cries, and also sort of reconciling with the reality that not only is the baby something that can and does cry, goes through mysteries of its own desire, frustration, and always comes out on the other end as some deep, profound happiness. Does that get at kind of what you're trying to get at with the hyperhuman?
Yeah, I think it's an embracing of, we're living in this river and everything is flowing through us. And this is partly why I spend so much time journaling, and really trying to understand, the cycles, and actually it is cyclical, and there is no straight lines. And I think that's the transhuman myth, that there is this kind of progress. And even if we look at our own lives, there is no such progress. That, I was more poetic when I was 16 than I am now. And why is that? Why do we have these different skills at different times that we tend to lose? There's certain skills a baby has in terms of identifying. What was that experiment where they can identify differences between monkeys that we don't, like, even at 5 years old, we don't have anymore. So, I think that there are, it's another hyperhuman practice, and I've written a whole paper for one of your anthologies on Hegel, all around this sort of Hegelian journaling, and how do we really map out, and without that path into the origin story and not understanding the origins of things. Because one thing I notice is that I continuously revisit the same themes in a spiral over and over again throughout life until I resolve them. And it's almost like, it is this kind of this attractor where I'm attracting the same scenario in different forms in order to actually progress. And I do think there is a progression of sorts, but it's in a spiral, and it's cyclical. And I guess I'm really, again, I was talking to Layman about this, having kids, as you are going through right now, Cadell, is like you're revisiting your own childhood through those eyes, through that childlike state, and you're dropping into that the no time, and not being in this kind of like constant cult of productivity that we're all stuck in. So I think the hyperhuman thing is, let's find ways to drop into pure consciousness and to be human beings rather than human doings all the time. And I think that's just the basic necessity of the age that we're in. And if we can't take this opportunity, that maybe if AGI ever appears, it will be an opportunity for us to be more in communitas and more in our own bodies and more in relation to all those other species that we do not have the no time to be with.
I'm taken by this term cult of productivity, because I'm definitely a member somehow of the cult of productivity, but it's also connected to capitalism and industrial production. And I think, dropping into becoming a father and being around a newborn, it does give you an interesting perspective on that, because you do feel in a very visceral way the antinomy between your productivity and the baby, because not only does the baby not give any care at all about your productivity and cuts right into any of your free time to be productive, but it also possesses a kind of joy of being and a trauma of being as well. There's a joy and a trauma of being that seem to be very closely linked. And it does give you an insight into that. I mean, I could go deeper in terms of capitalism, industrial production, and how that shapes us as subjects. But is that connected to your work as well, Layman? Like basically questioning, quote unquote, the cult of productivity and cultivating a mode of being that is maybe not at odds with maybe not at odds with production, because I don't think production is only bad, but perhaps balancing it out, if that's the right word.
Yeah, I think balance is a decent word to apply to that, because there are ways in which all of us are not as productive as we need to be, right? When we think about those basic prefrontal cortex skills of temporal organization and intentionality and being able to handle stress without freaking out and being precise and building structures and holding ourselves to things, there's a lot that productivity represents that is a necessary set of human skills that, frankly, frankly, most of us aren't very good at and need to put a lot more work into developing. That said, that's a subset of the possible versions of a productivity ethos. And a bunch of the other versions are distressing and degenerative and only serve forces other than our own lives and well-beings and families and networks. And when we look at the way that growth and development and richness operates outside of those systems, we realize there are intentional things we need to do in order to access those other restorative and transformative capacities. So I think, from my point of view, we have too narrow a definition of productivity, right? That the being unproductive, being cyclic and phasic and grieving and, lazy in the fore, all those things should be understood in proper proportion as being part of a real definition, a human and ecologically resonant form of the notion of productivity. What we have now is a very hollow and narrow version. And I love that Carl brought up cycles because, it's not necessarily problematic that this is three bearded white guy intellectuals having this discussion, but the female perspective is much more, through the menstrual cycle and other things, aware of the fact that you move through phases, and those phases make enormous amounts of difference, and you come out that phase on the other side going into new phases. You see that in a baby, you see that in these processes. It's not about emotionally escaping from the different and potentially negative phases. It's about being capable of going through phases such that we are restored and transformed. And like Carl said, it can become more of a spiral. But to get to that spiral, you have to allow yourself to go into something that feels like it might be a circle that traps you forever. And yet that should be understood as an extremely productive thing to do.
I really do agree. There was a point in my life where I felt like I was becoming a kind of industrial production machine, and there was always the risk of burnout there. But actually, ever since coronavirus, I've kind of balanced. It's not just that I produce an essay before breakfast or something like that. It's actually, there has been a balance where, in order to maintain a kind of conventional understanding of production, I've actually fallen into these, you described it really well, Layman, these cycles or circles that appear as if it could trap you forever in relationship to reconnecting with things that I loved in childhood, whether it's my love of baseball or video games or other hobbies that I had as a kid. Just reconnecting with these things and allowing myself the space to re-engage with these things without feeling as if I was wasting my productive potential or something has been one of the most important things for my psyche that I've done in the last 5 years. And this just seems intuitively super connected to your idea of Hegelian journaling, Carl, and things you already brought up about how your 16-year-old self was deeply poetic and somehow you're not as poetic anymore. But this idea I wanted to explore with you in relationship to this might be fascinating is, what role does, quote unquote, reconnecting with things you loved in childhood play in your own exploration of either journaling or hyperhuman practice? Is that relevant?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see myself as a living archive where I've never really thrown anything away. And maybe that's because my dad cut me off at 12 and said, "That's it now, son. I'm not going to give you anything else. Like, that's it. You're on your own." And that was actually a major gift in my life to really seek out everything that I've gathered. I mean that in every sense. Yeah, I mean, even if we look at things like fan fiction, like, I mean, the animation and the things that I was subjected to as kids' TV really had a fundamental impact on me, back in the day. And I know fan fiction is a huge topic where people, aren't happy with the stories that they were told as kids, so they revisit them and improve on those stories because they ended badly or they didn't end in a way that they wanted. And I think I've applied that kind of philosophy generally in terms of that journaling, because it is, we distort our memories. We have false memories. We tell lies to ourselves in order to get through our lives. We lie to ourselves. And I guess I'm really interested in the hyperhuman 360 view, where we sit inside our lies and we sit inside the shadow and we don't try and hide from it. And you know, a lot of the time it's the default mode network that makes it very difficult to sit inside that backstage, because we can't take it. We can't take all the lies. We can't take how much we've, you know, disappointed ourselves and therefore disappointed others. But I guess I'm really interested in this non-dual perspective, and I've had extraordinary, you know, transcendental experiences of a life review, for instance, where I experienced my whole life in reverse, and I was able to enter other bodies and become them and me at the same time. And I realized that is the true reality, where we are no longer tied to our point of view, but we have field of view access. And I think that that's the operating system. That's really my operating system, and why I'm really interested in going hyper. And obviously we associate hyper with negative connotations, but it's about hyper awareness. It's about hyper, you know, dimensionality, and really believing that this is not the reality. We're not just in this reality. We're in multiple realities at the same time. And I guess, you know, I think that, you know, we assume this fixed identity, and that is at the core of this cult of productivity. We are human to-do lists based on this identity, and I think that that becomes a very neurotic and problematic way of being. And I think that my way of looking at things is that we are different. In this mini death every night we sleep, we are going into this other world. And in this other world, we can shift identities, and we can become shapeshifters, and we can, you know, we can really understand sleep as a form of, you know, consciousness, and a form of productivity, if you like, that if you do it well, because I think it is the ultimate longevity hack. You know, ironically, it's about not doing, it's about resting. And I think that the danger of being too much in the human doing is that we forget how to rest. And then then you need deep rest or deep depression in order to overcome the burnout. So yeah, I hopefully that's scratched the surface of that question.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but I've always appreciated this distinction you bring up from point of view to field of view. And I actually had in the Christian atheism course, I developed a Christian atheist interpretation of it, where point of view would be like God's eye point of view, but Holy Spirit would be like field of view. And you get from point of view to field of view, or God to Holy Spirit, through the crucifix, through the lack, through the negativity. It's like the crucifixion of your point of view opens you into field of view. I'm not sure how much that synergizes with how you spontaneously think about it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my firm belief is that because I had that spontaneous experience of a life review, and I felt as if I was getting a preview onto death. That in death, whether it is in the bardo or whatever you want to call that transition, but you know, this is a learning lab. We're all learning, and the ultimate learning is to step outside of the limited point of view and to experience what you've done to somebody as them and you in a double consciousness. And that's when you break into the field of view. And you know,
That's great.
yeah, in my experience, I had the choice of where I placed my consciousness in this double consciousness. But maybe in the death state there is no choice, and you are forced into those perspectives, or those double consciousnesses that are the most challenging, that have caused the most harm, and all ripples in the consciousness, and therefore you know, all harm is revisited. Whether you like it or not, you know, all of what Peter Thiel and all these you know, these madmen in who think they're in control, maybe going to have a rude awakening when they see exactly, you know, what they've done with their limited 1,000 month lifespans.
I think the future political utopia is for sure in libertarian startup cities with no regulation, and I'm sure nothing bad will happen there. I'm sure they know what they're doing. I want to play on another idea that you're sharing, Carl, and I'll throw a question to Layman, which is, you're saying we're human to-do lists. It's another, you have all these little catch lines that are quite useful. And it's relevant because my partner this morning was spending time reading a book called Getting Things Done. It's a pretty famous book, actually, Getting Things Done, and it's very practical, but it's related to becoming a human to-do list. And I wanted to connect that to going a bit deeper down the in capitalism and industrial productivity rabbit hole. There's a theory that I think was developed by a political thinker in our circles, Benjamin Studebaker, that early stage capitalism focuses on production and late stage capitalism focuses more on consumption. So there's like this movement from industrial productivity to consumer society. And I think that that is an informative way of thinking about the development from late to, who knows if we're in late stage capitalism, maybe we're in middle stage capitalism, maybe we're still in some early phase of capitalism. But just that the associations I have with consumption are even more negative than the associations I have with production. That when we think about ourselves as consumers, usually we think about that in a negative light. And at the same time, I'm feeling like our conversation is looking for a different word, when we're thinking about not being productive. Like basically, when we think about an antithesis to being productive, and if it's framed to us as consumption, there's something that I feel like there's still something missing there with how we're thinking about these things. And at the same time, of course, we could frame consumption differently. I've been thinking about it in terms of buying power and the importance of buying power, specifically when it comes to basic needs like home. Like when we think about consumption or having buying power to own a home, I see that as extremely positive. But I guess it's not getting at what that ultimately is serving, which to me is related to what we were talking about having the space to not being productive, being able to go into a state of either relaxation or reflection or just non-productivity, being in that childish state of just being able to be. There's several threads there, but Layman, I'd be interested to know what you think about that. Am I pointing in the right direction, thinking about productivity, consumption, but there's something lacking there?
Yeah, it's an interesting way of thinking to look at that shift in capitalism. I think we would want to add into that the shift toward consumption is also the shift toward a different mode of production, right? It's a shift away from producing goods and services, but it's a shift toward compulsive cultural production. And whether that's making essays and videos or tweeting or telling everyone your opinion on politics, there's a sense in which there is actually an expanded productivity ethos within late stage capitalism. But consuming has two interesting features. One is it's passive, and that passivity is supposed to invoke a persuadability, right? Capitalism would have to reproduce us as people who can be persuaded to purchase this product, purchase that product, watch that show, vote for this person. We have to be gullible in that system. The other thing is that it's done by the metaphor of food. If you are only thought about as one who eats, then the aspiration would be just the maximum amount of food flowing into your mouth. But that's not what good quality eating is like. Good quality eating involves choice of what to eat. You have to bite it, you have to chew it, you have to digest it, you have to take time, you have to limit your intake, you have to build skills in evaluating and constructing food. So there's something there, right? Good eaters, good assimilators, and that there's something in that proactive selection and assimilation process that might be a way we could think about being the beings who can live in the worlds that are emerging.
I've been missing out on the biting and chewing part. I just shoveled it. No, being good assimilators. I mean, I think you emphasize their consumption. I like the metaphor of food, the connection there to passivity and persuadability. Can we think, just a follow-up question, are you only thinking about passivity and persuade in a negative sense, or are you more trying to point towards, is there an art to passivity and an art to persuadability that we actually need to explore more in a mode of political economy that's consumer-based?
I was using them as mildly pejorative terms in this particular instance, but I think the key to all of these sorts of discourse is to tease everything apart into its more or less productive versions, right? Michael Levin's work in trying to wrangle cells to produce new sorts of beings at Tufts Lab, that revolves around his thinking about a kind of stack of expanded scales of persuadability. So I think there's an art to persuading and being persuaded that could have more and more means and complexity. So what we're really looking at is a crude or overly narrow form of persuadability and passivity. Passivity as well is something that we can be actively involved in getting better at, because the goal is not to just, be lazy or depressed or laying down on the ground, even though that might sometimes be what you require in order to restore and rebalance yourself. But really, we want to be healthy, proactive participants in arranging our lives such that we have adequate reception and adequate production, adequate restoration and adequate use of the self, adequate personal time and adequate network time, so to speak. So it is about getting those balances right, and it's about thinking about more nuance and higher grades of sophistication in how we perform these tasks, because if we don't do them well, the natural system will try to do them for us, possibly at the lowest possible level.
I guess same sort of logic or line of reasoning to you, Carl, when I talk about production and consumption and thinking about the art of these things, maybe the art of what Layman was pointing towards with expanded scales of persuadability, or thinking about a different form of passivity. Where do your intuitions point?
Yeah, I mean, I think our buying power, in a sense, is our only power. And I'm really interested in how we can utilize technology to make better decisions about where we get our water, where we buy our electricity, where we shop. I mean, you've got these barcode readers now that'll tell you whether this item that you're buying is involved in destruction of the rainforest or child slavery. And I think this is exactly the kind of technological innovation that is useful. And I think that we are moving from an information economy to an experiential economy where we don't want to just watch films, we want to be in them. And this follows my thinking since 2014 around we're moving from a content-based economy to a context-based economy, where context engineering is really the future, and that really again is amplified, and some of my early thoughts around this were related to psychedelics and the contextual design of when you're taking a medicine like a psychedelic, that 80% of that medicine is the context and how you design the pre-context, the post-context, your mindset, your body set, and your environment. So I think that having an understanding, if we are consuming in that sense, that there is a lot of design that can be utilized to get the best out of those consumptions. And I see now context engineering is really blown up in the AI world, primarily because prompt engineering wasn't enough. Prompt was your content, like just give me a prompt, tell me to do something. But if you tell the machine to do something in a specific way, under certain contextual factors and limitations, then you'll get a much better result. So I think that applies across the board. And I think that our patterns of consumption and production should be aware of the power of context engineering.
Really interesting
point. Let me throw one thing in there quickly,
go ahead.
Cadell, which is, and this is a place where I think there's a lot of overlap between Carl's thinking and my thinking, which is that there's a capacity to be better intentional participants in perception as a form of selection and consumption and assimilation. And the degree to which we are better at that form of consumption translates into different expectations and different participatory decisions we make in establishing human techno-social and economic systems around consumption. So if we're better at the immediate existential form of receiving, then we can become better at the expanded and elaborated technosocial forms of receiving.
I think that is relevant to where I wanted to take it and actually reframe something that you presenced at the beginning of the podcast, Layman, specifically about this false dichotomy between the ethno-state and the international workers' interpretation of things. But first wanted to frame it in terms of what Carl was saying about buying power is our only power. And I don't know if I'm right, but I'm increasingly thinking about buying power as real democracy. Like, if you don't have buying power, but you're allowed to vote, and if the democratic systems are undermining or eroding your buying power, like, for example, the capacity to own a home, are you really in a democracy? And this is an idea that I've been chewing on for a while, because at the beginning of Hegel's philosophy of right, property is at the first dialectical point of his system. Property is at the foundation of things. Now, you can go deeper down that role, but while I agree with you, Layman, that these false dichotomies of the ethno-state and the international workers are something that we need to think beyond. I also want us to maybe spend a little more time, or at least I've been, maybe I'll try and provoke it in this direction, to reflect what I've been calling the truth of symptoms. Like that the ethno-state and the international workers are symptoms, but there's a truth in the symptoms that we need to think beyond them. I've been specifically committed to this idea in terms of enduring the rise of someone like Nick Fuentes, who I think is a perfect accelerationist symptom in the sense that he's giving people a very simplistic model of things. He's giving people a very identitarian enemy that can simplify a complex reality. There are aspects of what he says that are legitimate, and then aspects of things that he says that are completely ridiculous. But approaching him on the level of presuppositions also doesn't seem to work, because there's a performative dimension of the desire for an ethno-state, which is speaking to something deep, especially in young men, I think, that's related to buying power. Which is that I think young men today, and in an accelerationist world, I think young men today, they feel like they don't own anything. They feel like they're growing up in a world where they have no real stakes in it, where they have no real representation, where somehow, somewhere, someone's in control, someone's in charge, and maybe that's a false view. But just this idea, and then I'll throw it to you, but I think it's connected to a Marxist interpretation of accelerationism where everything solid melts into air. And I feel like people just feel like they don't have any stakes in society. They don't have any buying power. Nothing's really theirs. They have no real inheritance. And the older generation doesn't get it. So there's a confluence of ideas there. But I guess the core thing is can we see this dichotomy between the desire for an ethno-state and the desire to protect international workers as somehow pointing to this crisis caused by accelerationism, that people just feel powerless and ownerless and propertyless? And how do we think about that?
Are you asking me?
I mean, it's a general question, but yeah, I would frame it at you first, and then maybe like the same idea to Carl. And if you know if it's too ambitious of a question, it's also something that we can hold off, and maybe it's something that I'll use as a prompt in our opening session in the portal.
It's a great question, and there is that kind of a feeling, right, that we live in a world where, like, one of the reasons homelessness stands out to us as a problem is not just because of the people suffering from it, it's because we all vaguely feel homeless, unheimlich, right? There's a sense in which everything seems to be slipping through our fingers, and I think that's going to be massively intensified by the ongoing degradation of the information landscape, where, right, it's one thing that, I don't feel like I can accomplish home ownership. It's another thing if I can't trust a single piece of information coming to me through the social system that I live in. I think there have been times historically, right, and our archaic ancestors faced an environment that was somewhat like this, right? A lot of those indigenous cultures from prehistory seem to have felt like they were not the owners of the world, that they were temporary custodians and participants in a world that was shifting, that was complex, that was chaotic, where things were often not what they seemed, where you couldn't get a simple human conceptual handle on what things were and then just grasp them and hold on to them in a way that might give you some temporary trust. But they didn't necessarily suffer from that the way that we seem to be suffering from it. So one of the things I would want to investigate in a discussion like this would be, are there basic existential factors within us that predispose us to be unsatisfied with or be constructive participants in a world where we have to recognize the fluidity and ephemerality of all the objects and systems that we participate in? I think there are better and worse ways to do that, and I think different kinds of circumstances and skill developments in individuals make us more or less capable of participating in that. Because in some ways, like depending on the time scale you're looking at, no one ever has anything. But that doesn't mean the desire to have that experience of having something is inappropriate. It's just that what do we need to do in order to get that within ourselves, within our relationships and communities, and also within the socioeconomic systems we produce?
I'm thinking here of colossal political antagonism between shamanism and National Socialism. See how that unfolds. Carl, yeah, no, that's a great reflection though, Layman. Seriously, about how do we as subjects reconcile with temporality and ephemerality? Are our notions on that philosophical level, should we more deeply question our notions of property and ownership? I guess the first thing I would say as not a counterpoint, but as like something to contextualize these reflections is that I would be fine with that so long as there wasn't a small population of people who did own everything. And so I think that there's a great wisdom and a great value in reconciling with temporality and ephemerality. And at the same time, at least in myself, I struggle with the inequality and distribution of things. And what does it mean to own things today? And what does it mean to have property today? These are things I'm going to take in with me for our sessions. But Carl, same line of reasoning, same sort of thought process, and connected to what you were saying about buying power as our only power, and some of my reflections about that as connected to real democracy. And there are these symptoms today. I'm not sure how much you're tracking them about ethno-nationalism in England. It's quite big right now. There are a lot of people in England I'm tracking on this specific topic, but then also this idea of international workers movement and how do we think these things. But yeah, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how much the UK is getting attention right now. You know, they're trying to get rid of jury by trial at the moment, so it's an extraordinary time for a Labour government, a socialist government, to be supposedly socialist. But yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, and certainly I wouldn't entertain the possibility of answering it now. But I think, you know, it is ownership in some sense is illusory. I mean, it is like you live for such a short period of time. I think that, you know, when I think, like I said earlier, about hoarding, you know, as a way of protecting yourself, it's like it's true. Your possessions will possess you, you know, and I think that that's a huge issue. I also think that when I look at the young people that I teach today, it's both heartbreaking and enlivening that the gap between thinking or imagining and producing what you've imagined is becoming so acceleratedly, you know, it's becoming much shorter a journey. I mean, if we think about the main skill that a lot of these kids will, you know, they all want to still be in these old skills. A lot of them want to make films and they want to be cameramen and lighting engineers, but actually vibe coding, whether we like it or not, is actually, you know, alongside context engineering, probably the skill to have. And you can see people building whole companies in a weekend with the right skills. And I think that that's changing the game. And I think that this is still very early days. But yeah, that you know, the billion-dollar company from an 18-year-old is coming. And I think that it's just about imagination. It's about cultivating, you know, your understanding of how to use these technologies in a hyperhuman way that does have, as we mentioned before, using crypto to, you know, solve climate issues, or, you know, it's huge paradoxes all the way down. And I think it's just a case of like, how do we, you know, what was it I reading the other day? I think somewhere in Scandinavia, they're using the heat generated from data centers to power or heat the city. So it's really about understanding how these flows of energy and these flows of production and the flows of consumption and the opportunities for young people, because you know, I get the debate, and I get that, you know, so many men, especially young men just feel completely out of the loop and hopeless. But I think that that's part of my role now as an elder. This is why I'm getting the you know, growing the beard, really, is to really give hope to the Gen Zers, and what I see is a lot of deep thinking in them, you know, and a lot of reflection on how they can not do the same things that the generation above them did.
You know, in defense of beards. You know, look, this has been I think a great opening reflection for our month. And there's one other big thing that I want to presence that I think is important for apocalyptarian accelerationism before maybe offering a summary of what people can expect throughout the month with the three of us. It's this idea that with AGI, and specifically accelerationism, which is being mediated by the potential emergence of AGI, we confront this technology, which is not just a normal double-edged sword. Like, we know every technology is a double-edged sword, right? Like, the invention of fire was a double-edged sword. You can cook a great meal, you can burn down the village. But with AGI, you get almost like the ultimate theological positive and negative. Like, you can create heaven, you can create hell. You have you have Gen Z, who's completely hopeless, and you have the potential for the first 18-year-old billionaire. You have this kind of nostalgic crisis of people wanting to learn all these old skills that have no longer any relevance, because you're going to be able to use Grok next year to just prompt it, and it'll be able to make a movie. So there's no more need for filmmakers. And at the same time, the creative potential of this technology is just off the charts, depending on what skills you're cultivating and depending on what perspective you're bringing to this technology. So I feel like part of what we're exploring here with apocalyptarian accelerationism is the subjective disposition we need to approach like this ultimate object, like this crazy theological potentials of utopia and dystopia, of heaven and hell. And I want to situate that in what we were talking about, Layman, before pressing record, about you exploring these intense intersubjective networks that are creating something larger than themselves, exploring religious themes, exploring spiritual themes that in a creative, participatory way, instead of just going back to some image of a previous religion that needs to be rehabilitated or something like that. And how you understand how these tendencies, how these network dynamics that are emerging, how that interfaces with these radical, almost infinite positive potentials and infinite negative potentials. And how do you make sense of all that?
Yeah, there are a lot of networks, I think, starting to converge around some of these possibilities. Networks that might have been very oriented only to permaculture or only to developmental thinking or only to some particular spiritual framework. And what we're seeing is a lot of overlap now between people in these communities and between skill sets, and a lot of space in that overlap for an experimentation in that space have to do with creating intersubjective resonances or a surplus coherence generated interpersonally. And I think that's the ground zero of religious phenomenon. That's how spirit is evoked into the social dimension. I think people are starting to not only experiment with it in larger numbers, but try to figure out what are the dynamics that causes it to operate. And that can help us restore potentially some of the sacred shared civic spirit of our societies. It could help us restore the existing religions, but it also opens up a whole new body of wisdom, which is how do we generate these experiences in general? How do they grow? How do they flourish in the world? How much are they needed as an antidote to fragmentation? But also, what do the skill sets necessary for this kind of practice afford us in terms of facing the world that we've been discussing here today? And I think there's a lot of focus on multilateral thinking. There's a lot of focus on, you need a kind of a 360 vision, like Carl is saying, in order to be present to the emergent, abstract, coherent field and not just focused on one or a bunch of the component participants. You need to have a lot of somatic grounding. You need to be able to move fluidly between different intelligences in yourself. You need to be able to sort of improvisationally speak when necessary and be a receiver of interesting content and novel emergences when that comes up. And I think there's a kind of a built-in not only skill set, but a kind of an ethos built into that experience that creates a lot of the necessary wisdom that might sustain us in the face of a breakdown of social forms, a breakdown of what it requires human beings to be able to do cognitively to make civilization run, a breakdown of how well we can trust information in general. Because if you think about like here you are in front of a digital machine, right? Are you mentally just caught up in that digital machine, or are you also anchored in the somatic experience of the body? Are you caught up in your own narcissistic reactionary responses to the content you're being fed, or are you tracking a kind of balanced relational mutuality with the other participants? Are you zeroed in, or are you capable of an expanded field? Are you holding enough coherence, generating and receiving enough coherence that the different fragmentary distresses that you get through the digital devices can be subsumed into that? Or do you have an insufficient access to coherence such that that seems like an overwhelm that you have no choice but to either flee or go on the offensive against? So I think there are a lot of skills being developed in these communities for people to renormalize and rehumanize and resacralize the experience of the kind of late stage capitalist technological super condition that we're living in. And also, I would say that an enormous number of these communities are not only spiritual and developmental in their thinking, they're skewing shamanic. They're very interested in the elemental, the imaginal, the ecological, the earth, the space, the place is often very much foregrounded in terms of the establishment of these fields and seems to play a significant, at least psychological role in how people set these things up. And I think that's going to be an essential part of how we retain sanity. Then the only other thing I would add to that is these are also elite shared human sense-making spaces. Because if you get into a situation like we're in right now in the world where you basically can't trust most of the news and most of the things that are rising to the top of your feed, and you magnify that massively 10 years down the road, where most of the content is not generated by humans, most of it is skewed, most of it is designed to be able to hack your dopamine systems and persuade you of things, then you've got to do your sense-making outside of the general reception of information that goes on in the civilization. You have to find high-quality human sense makers who can gather in person and share information from different kinds of internal systems in a way that is coherent and supportive and in touch with ecological complexities. And so that's one of the things that goes on in these spaces in addition to the production of these fields is just an opportunity to sort of get the real news that you are no longer able to access through conventional mechanisms.
I think that's a great point, that these networks are potentially forms of high-level trust and fidelity of information due to the nature of the people participating in them and the commitment to a different way of being and a different way of thinking. Carl, I suppose similar question to you is a closing reflection on accelerationism, just this same idea. I mean, you brought it up with this gap between people in Gen Z with old skills and new skills, the strangeness of the landscape, the incredible potential, and at the same time, the widespread doomerism. How do you think about some of these extremes?
Yeah, well, I think at the basis of all eras, we had a new type of media technology. If we think about the oral tradition and its role in the hunter-gatherer societies, and then the printing press creating the state effectively, and the Enlightenment, and then you've got like the electric era, the digital era, creating modern globalism. And I think now with AI and whether we do get AGI, and I don't think we will get AGI from the current cul-de-sac of large language models. I think it will certainly be, computer vision and seeing how we operate in the world rather than through language will advance the scene. In terms of, just in terms of the next, AGI or even generative AI, like whether that leads to human's last exam or whether it leads to dead internet theory, which is, this general idea that, social media will die a death because you won't know whether anyone's watching. It will just be bots that are liking stuff and maybe even definitely producing stuff. So, people will lose faith in social media. Maybe that's a good thing, ultimately, maybe that's a good thing for it to die. But, on the other side, maybe we'll also abandon screens. And I think the unintended consequences of a lot of these things, like deep fakes, both in terms of audio and visual, is that we end up just like hikikomoriing. We go hikikomori. We just abandon screens. It's kind of the last thing that they would expect. But I can see it. I can see trends. I mean, even like when you go to your average dinner party in London. It's like whoever touches their phone first pays the bill. We've got clubs now where you go dancing and nobody's, when you go into the club, they put a sticker on your camera, so you're not allowed to actually use your phone. And people are relishing in that kind of, that new world, which is the old world in so many ways. But, and even like, rubber stamping reality and saying, yeah, this is actually a real event. Like we would have to have reality checkers. That would be the new journalists that would go out and actually see if something's actually happening and reality checking it. But I think in terms of my thinking around accelerationism, rather as we started the conversation, rather than accelerating capital and machine forces, I think hyperhumanism is really here to accelerate perceptual awareness, i.e. things like deep listening. How do we learn to listen again, not only to ourselves but to each other and to everything else in reality? So I'm very interested in our ecological entanglement and our multi-species relationality. So that's kind of what I'll be bringing to the party. It's hyper because we need hyper awareness to counter the dulling down and the soothing that we've all been subjected to, and that's been normalized. And hyper relationality, that's that.
Well, I think my relationship with both of you have been some of probably the greatest aspects of my engagement with what I call this para-academic network. Both of you have brought so much to Philosophy Portal. Carl, with your contributions to the anthologies, as well as the retreats, and Layman with your opening for the portal. Now going to be 3 years in a row this January, and it's an honor to collaborate with both of you because I think both of you are such creative minds. When people talk about trans or interdisciplinarity, oftentimes in institutional contexts, it's actually quite disappointing what's produced in these environments, but I see both of you as living examples of either transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary thinkers and beings. Our month in January is formally titled Accelerationism for Apocalyptarians. At the risk of making it too wordy and too long, I almost want to say Accelerationism for Apocalyptarian Hyperhumans or something like that. Seems fitting. Our first event will be focused on accelerationist philosophy, so we'll do a deep dive into the background on accelerationist thought, and Layman, Carl, and I will discuss that. The second event will be led by Carl, titled Hyperhuman Methods for Accelerationism, and hopefully we'll get into some of the practical things that we've only touched on, scratched the surface in previous conversations, as well as the conversation today. Layman will lead the third event, titled Apocalyptarian Accelerationism, and this is inspired in part by my interest in Layman's work on apocalyptarianism. He did a great presentation at the Stoa a few years ago, which I found very motivating and informative, so I would recommend people check that out if they haven't already. Hopefully that will be a deepening of this exploration. And then finally, we'll do a session on the inhuman dimension of humanism, where we talk about, I think, something Layman brought up in this podcast about how the inhuman and the darker elements of the human are key for the production of the human, and we'll see where we go. But I'll give you two both final thoughts, maybe on what you're hoping for the month and any other reflections you want to share with the viewers. So, Layman, I'll start with you.
There's so much here. Every little aspect of what we've discovered is like an entire genre of discourse waiting to happen. So I'm extremely excited to be a part of this. I think we're going to be able to, all of us, bring in a lot of different richness of content that straddles a whole number of fields. I'm really excited to be thinking with intelligent, complex, transdisciplinary people about what a pro-human and pro-ecological alternative to transhuman is. I've got a lot of my own feelings out of my own personal practice and my own thinking on this subject, but it really comes alive when you find interlocutors that have also been putting serious thought into that. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a tremendous amount of fun. I think it's going to be aspirational and inspirational, as well as being deeply versed in a sort of a theopolitical and socio-critical, philosophic, psychoanalytic, and political lens that you often don't hear in tandem with thinking about the deep spiritual, shamanic, and ecological transformations of the human.
Fantastic. Carl, same to you. What are you thinking about or anticipating in the month as a whole? Any final reflections?
Yeah, I mean, super excited for it. I think what I'll bring to the party is, yeah, some of the more practical things that we can do, maybe even an ecology of practices for re-enchanting the world or re-enchanting our humanity, and that'll be, a whole look at contextology, which is the science of context engineering, hacking, technology as scaffolding, haptic creative practices, imagination cultivation, and perceptual augmentation, and conscious imagination. I think developing new literacies, and yeah, looking at the liminal states and how do we make the most of those hypnagogic and hypnopompic states that we are in our most creative mind, and so many of us don't utilize those spaces.
All right, guys, links will be in the description to the month. You can sign up independently through either Layman Pascal's website or Carl Hayden Smith's website, and I'll have links to both in the description. All Philosophy Portal members will get access to the month, so if you want to get involved that way, that's also a possibility. So 3 different ways to get involved, 3 different ways to support this work. It will be Accelerationism for Apocalyptarians with Layman Pascal and Carl Hayden Smith. This has been a great, I think, introductory conversation, laying the groundwork for some of the things we'll further explore in the portal. And this has been Cadell Last with Layman Pascal and Carl Hayden Smith, and we're out. This January in the portal, we will be hosting Layman Pascal and Carl Hayden Smith for a month-long investigation into apocalyptarian hyperhumanism. Apocalyptarianism is a concept developed by Layman Pascal to confront the way death, grief, and the impossibility of our moment can be a source for building. Hyperhumanism is a concept developed by Carl Hayden Smith, focused on using technology as a means towards exploring the higher ends of the human being beyond the pleasure principle. Together, Pascal and Smith will actively attempt to build a bridge between these 2 concepts for a new understanding of the human condition. To find out more or to get involved this January, check the links in the description.